grades are the brave who fight for you. If you don't gain, they fight in vain. Show them what you can do. Show them what you can do. Please show them what you can do. I said, in this parade, please wave your grades at the brave who fight for you. If you don't gain, they fight in vain. Show them what you can do. Show them what you can do. Please. Good afternoon, and from KUAW.org in Kansas City, Missouri, this is WAVE Your Grades, American students striving for excellence in honor of our troops. And my name is Carl Boyd, your civilian
recording in progress
of our WAVE Your Grades program. Today is January 15th. A very special day marking the birthday of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And for the program, Wave Your Grades, it is a very special day because we had a very special guest. This afternoon, we have the honor of having as guest on Wave Your Grades, Cheryl Brown Henderson. And Cheryl Brown Henderson is the founding president of the Brown Foundation for Educational Equity, Excellence, and Research. Let me say a very personal and warm welcome. Thank you, Cheryl Brown Henderson, for being with us.
Thank you, Brother Boyd, for the invitation to be here on this second weekend.
Well, I'll tell you, the reason I would suggest to anybody who is listening that it is a singular honor is because we are celebrating January 15th, Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday with someone who is an equally historic figure. And there is so much, Cheryl, that I would like to ask you. So it might sound peculiar that I will start my questions to you about someone else, but you and I have discussed the pardon of Homer Plessy, attended by his descendant Keith Plessy. And I was just wondering, as we introduce our interview with you, your reflections on that occasion.
Yeah, thank you for that opportunity. I was just very happy for the Plessy family. First of all, I know Keith and have known him for a number of years, as well as Phoebe Ferguson, his partner. He calls her his partner in history, and I love that title. So the two of them were able to be present for the pardon, posthumous pardon of Homer Plessy on the part of the state of Louisiana. And it's something they've been working on for a long time. And it sets a precedent because others who stood up for civil rights during that era, the state will act in kind to make sure they are pardoned because they stood up for what was right. So they did not commit a crime. They were simply engaging in civil disobedience for something that was so wrong. So it really warmed my heart. And I know Keith, when I watched the ceremony, was very emotional. He was very moved by the fact that, all these many years later, over 125 years, that, his descendant was being recognized, appreciated, valued, and ultimately pardoned, would not have that criminal record on his legacy.
One of the things that is so important as we deal with students of the 20s, of the 2020s even, as it relates to their awareness first of something called Plessy versus Ferguson, and aware of the importance of such an historical event. As you travel, do you find or do you think that our young people today are as acutely aware of such historical factors in their development, or do we need to do a lot more teaching?
No, I don't think they are as aware as we would like them to be. So one of the things I always do, and I'm leaving on Sunday to head over to Michigan and then over to Indiana for the week to speak at a couple of universities. But what I always do is begin by making sure they understand that the United States Supreme Court of our country had ample opportunity to put us in a position that we wouldn't be having marches this very day with respect to voting rights. And what I mean by that is there are two seminal events that really turned the tide. The Dred Scott case in 1857, pre-Civil War, when Dred Scott sued for his freedom, and the United States Supreme Court said that rights conferred on white citizens could not be conferred on African American citizens. So basically, very early on, the United States Supreme Court said African Americans, it was never intended that we be citizens. The second is 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson. I always talk about that as well because it set the precedent for separate but equal, which we lived with, throughout the Jim Crow era into the early civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. So it's important for them to know those two historic flashpoints, if you will, because sometimes people don't understand, how do we get this way? How did the country get to a point of being so divided? They need to know that the division was almost woven into the fabric of our country, back in the mid 1800s. So they do need to know, and they don't know.
Let me remind those who are with us that you are hearing the voice of Cheryl Brown Henderson, the Brown family of Brown v. Topeka Board of Education, 1954. And for those of you who are young, who are with us, who may not remember or perhaps have not been taught, that Plessy versus Ferguson issued the very famous remembrance of the cliche, separate but equal. And to imagine that this was the law of the land, I'm speaking to Cheryl Brown Henderson. Until 1954, Brown v. Topeka Board of Education. One question that I have for Cheryl Brown Henderson is, in your young life, as you developed and matriculated in school and all of those things, how long did it take for you to really embrace the significance of what your family was a part of in 1954?
Well, to be honest, it took me until my 30s to fully embrace that. Once I had a couple of college degrees under my belt, began working at the state level as an educational administrator, I began to embrace it. And the reason I think that happened and why it wasn't embraced sooner, my father died in 1961 when I was only 10 years old. And 1961 was only 7 years after the Brown decision had been decided by the United States Supreme Court. The nation had not yet recognized the significance of that decision. They had not really understood the full weight of it and all of the pushback that would come after, which was rather immediate and continues to this day. So because of that, because losing the patriarch of our family, losing the namesake of that case, our focus shifted on just being a family. And my mom is then a single mother, keeping her daughters together and making sure life would continue as we had known it. So our focus was not on the history that we represented. So it wasn't until much, much later, as I said, my early 30s, after I began working for the state of Kansas as an educational consultant, because education was not only my bread and butter, it was something I lived and breathed. And that's when I really started tapping into what is this Brown v. Board and doing my own research. We had to really become students of Brown v. Board, even though our name was carried on that decision. So I recognized then, and then really devoted the rest of my life, thank goodness I'm still here, but I've devoted my life to making sure I educate others about Brown v. Board and its significance for them, because it made a difference for everybody, white, Black, Latino, Asian, everyone. And I try to convey that when I speak to various groups.
The interesting thing to me, or at least one interesting thing, is Cheryl Brown Henderson, in your younger age, probably ran into a person or two who surprised you as to how much they respected your family. And I'm just curious, out of personal curiosity, as to whether or not there was someone in particular, someone's in particular, whom you can remember kind of surprising you that they thought as much of you as you thought of them?
Well, I think for your listeners, it's going to be probably rather shocking as to who this person is, because I was surprised beyond words, even, and that was George H.W. Bush, of all people.
Yes.
I say that because when we opened the Brown v. Board of Education National Historic Site, a unit of the National Park Service that's in Topeka, Kansas, in one of the old segregated school buildings, he came out to be part of that grand opening, flew out on Air Force One and delivered remarks that day. After that meeting, first time I met him was that day. I was invited by him to the White House on 4 other occasions. And one of those occasions was dinner. And when I arrived that evening for dinner, along with other guests that were in attendance, my name, place, my card, just where I was to sit was right next to him. And later on, I found out that he had specifically asked that I sit next to him because he and his wife, Laura, who was an educator, a librarian, were very taken by what Brown v. Board meant to the country. And very taken by the fact that we were now, within proximity of one another, where he could extend that kind of invitation. So I was really surprised by that, Carl. And again, I'm sure your viewers or your listeners are probably pretty shocked by that as well.
Well, let me hazard a guess. I may or may not be correct in this, but I would suspect that Cheryl Brown Henderson was, and as you are, 1,000 points of light about which the president was speaking during those days.
Well, now, George W. Bush, I'm sorry, I said H.W., didn't I? So
George, I see. Okay.
Son in 2004 that I'm speaking of, that extended the invitations and came out to speak at our opening. So I misspoke. It was W, the younger Bush.
Okay, now let me, what you make me mindful of is the times in which we are living. Mm-hmm. And you and I having opportunities to address young people, not so much as you, but when I do, I look at the climate that we're in. Cheryl Brown Henderson of the Brown v. Topeka Board of Education enjoying a dinner with Republican George W. Bush in a climate that I'm sure was congenial. Cheryl Brown Henderson, as you look at the landscape today, what does America need to do to at least have the semblance of civility among those who might disagree ideologically?
It's an excellent question, because when you realize that when I was having that dinner and those invitations, it was a time that General Colin Powell or Secretary Powell was still with us. It was a time that when you look at the fact that George W. Bush has stood up, and spoken the truth to this current Republican Party, such as it is. And what we need now is exactly that, people that are willing to tell the truth. Lies have become political currency, and that's not something we should stand for. So I think that, something so small, that tiny little word truth, is what we need now more than anything. Prayer and truth is the only thing I could see that's going to turn this thing around.
As you know, Wanda has been privileged to meet you, as I have been privileged to meet you. And she is not in the room with me at this time, but she would have been so pleased with your response. Prayer and truth are absolutely imperative in the times in which we are living. And let me ask Cheryl Brown Henderson to help us to understand, as you have had the opportunity to travel as you do, how many other arenas are impacted by someone whose life is education. But Brown v. Topeka did not stop with its impact on schools. What are some other ways that we have been impacted?
One point I try to make, and you always want to leave a little nugget with people when you leave after you've given a presentation. So I want them to understand that the NAACP, Brown was the battlefront. Now you have to pick your battles, but society was the target. They really wanted to dismantle the legal framework for all of the discrimination, segregation, redlining, all of the things that were going on in this country. It took, marches and protests and civil disobedience really to make it real. But the Supreme Court, Thurgood Marshall and Jack Greenberg and Constance Baker Motley and all that, the legal team, they used public education as the place to do the battle. But once they came out victorious, and the 14th Amendment was the pivot for that decision, they were able to set a precedent that would dismantle. There was no longer any legal standing for racial segregation after Brown v. Board. And believe me, people in this country, the majority population that fought tooth and nail and still fighting tooth and nail to keep themselves in a place of power and privilege, began to push back immediately because they knew, they recognized that once the Supreme Court made that pronouncement, that the 14th Amendment stood, and it stood for all of us.
Yes.
And nobody's rights should be restricted, based on any category. They knew that their big lie of being superior, supreme, whatever you want to call it, was in jeopardy. And I think what we're seeing even today is a lot of the fear-based pushback to the fact that the demographics are changing in this country, to the fact that people of color recognize their political power, and they are shaking in their boots.
This is so very important. And as I broach the question about contact information and the kinds of engagements you are doing, while you contemplate that response, let me read to you just a couple of very ironic historical points. When you reminded me of the pardon that had taken place, and this is January 2022, as I looked at the history of it, it was very interesting that when they talked about separate but equal accommodations on trains, the court was in an opinion delivered by Justice Henry Billings Brown. That was the justice who wrote that opinion. And the only dissent was from John Marshall Harlan. And this was that many years ago. Interesting trivia, but not unimportant. And again, we are so indebted to you, your family. I would be interested in the kinds of presentations you are making and contact information for those who would like to call on you or to support what you are doing. So will you please give us that?
I will indeed. And let me say that Justice John Marshall Harlan, his descendants were also at the posthumous pardon ceremony that day.
Oh.
I will say about him that in his dissent, he said something that, should resonate with all of us. He said the Constitution is colorblind. And I think that is profound and poignant even today.
Thank you.
Sadly, people try to assign color to it. We treat African-American men that are killed at the hands of law enforcement when they are unarmed as though they have no constitutional protection, when the Constitution, in fact, is colorblind and protects them as well. But let me speak to your question. In terms of presentations, a lot of universities primarily and educational associations are the groups that I speak to most of the time. I am listed with a group of folks that represent many, many people around the country. The American Program Bureau, you can Google them and call their number. We have a website, the Brown Foundation, which is brownvboard.org. Proud of our website because what we do there is make accessible a lot of history, not simply about Brown v. Board and the individual players that were part of Brown, but also underrepresented groups. We have resources about Native American history and Asian American history and women's history and special issues on people like John Brown and immigrants from Ellis Island that settled in Kansas and Native American boarding schools and a lot of things that people are not reading about in textbooks. We try to include in the curriculum resources on our website. So if you go to brownvboard.org, we also have a new book that you can either read online or you can buy a hard copy, published by the University of Kansas. And it's entitled Recovering Untold Stories, Enduring Legacy of Brown v. Board of Education. And the book is a collection of essays written by people who were actually plaintiffs and involved in the 5 cases that comprise Brown v. Board of Education. This of them and essays written by their hand. It's compelling.
Outstanding. Please, Recovering Untold Stories.
Yes.
I will be repeating that often on this program. Let me remind those who are with us this afternoon that this is Waive Your Grades. We are hearing the voice of Cheryl Brown Henderson, founding president, Brown Foundation for Educational Equity, Excellence, and Research. What a privilege, what an honor it is. Waive Your Grades asks that our students in the United States of America, when encountering veterans and troops, go beyond waving the flag. But we ask that you waive your grades, waive your leadership, waive your community involvement, waive your academic excellence. And my name is Carl Boyd. I am your host. Louis George Walker is the founder of KUAW.org. Cheryl Brown Henderson, KUAW stands for Knowledge, Understanding, and Wisdom. And I'm going to ask Brother Louis George Walker now to give us contact information for the station and the fair that is presented from the W.E.B. Du Bois Learning Center in Kansas City, Missouri. Brother Walker, if you would. Thank you. That was Louis George Walker, founder of KUAW.org. Our privilege this afternoon is to speak with Cheryl Brown Henderson of Brown v. Topeka Board of Education. And Cheryl Brown Henderson, in the question that I posed earlier, talking about what might be surprising to some people, people whom you have met. You mentioned your dinner with then President George W. Bush and his wife. In that spirit, do we have cause for optimism as it relates to even in January 2022, some right-thinking people from different positions who are making efforts today that you know of to bring America into the direction it should be going?
That is a heavy question, Carl. You know, we look around and there is so little reason to believe that people can be persuaded because they seem to believe that the winning, being in a position that they're in, whether they're a government official, Congress, Senate, whatever, is the most important thing. You know, people seem to have abdicated any interest in true governing. And they seem to have gone over to the dark side of simply power for power's sake. With that said, what gives me hope is what's going on today. You know, that Martin Luther King III and LaTosha Brown are marching in Arizona. They will be marching Monday in Washington, D.C. We watched all of the protests in 2020 and early 2021. What gives me hope, and to give all of us hope, is that the multifaceted, multicultural, multiracial, global coalitions that were formed in the wake of the murder of Brother Floyd, these people now are themselves running for office. These people are now, speaking up and becoming part of the change that we all need. So we really have to cast our lot with the right thinking people that have taken a public stand for what we know to be right. Because as we sit here today, there are people that are scheming and planning and infiltrating, the very systems that we count on, and that's the electoral process. So we have to be wise. We cannot be lazy. Being a citizen of this country, especially now, is not a spectator sport. We have to be fully engaged. And anybody that tells me, especially a person of color, that they're not going to participate, they're not going to vote, they don't want to stand in that line, they are absolutely dismissing, any access to rights and privileges for all of us, in making those sorts of statements. Because I really think the people that are enacting these laws at the state level and really putting people in at the local level that will tinker with the vote, they are counting on our complacency. And 2020 illustrated, when you look at the number of people that voted in 2020, that, when you underestimate folks, that's when they rise to the occasion. So I'm telling your listeners right now, we are being underestimated. So let's surprise people once again by voting in unprecedented numbers in 2022, and especially in 2024. Never do you have someone in office that will do 100% of what you like. President Obama didn't do that. President Biden is not doing that because we have the stubborn and determined Senate, let's say, and leadership that makes it their mission to kill, any possibility of a more progressive agenda, which is something we all need. And someone feeling emboldened enough to make that statement, that our whole purpose is to make sure this president fails. It was said about President Obama, it's been said about President Biden. Any right-thinking person, you would be chilled to the bone. And that would motivate you to make sure you vote, knock on doors, tell your friends and neighbors, drive people to the polls, because that's the only way, that's our voice.
Now, let me say to Louis George Walker, who indicated that if there are those who would be interested in viewing and listening to this show later, how that access can indeed manifest. I want Louis George Walker to know I'm going to be one of those people, because I want to hear over and over and over again that last statement from Cheryl Brown Henderson, because Cheryl, at my age, at Louis's age, we realize that the trend suggests that in off presidential election years, the attendance goes down. And to hear Cheryl Brown Henderson suggest to us, we need to surprise those who are around us, not only as a surprise as to what they might predict, but Cheryl Brown Henderson, you and I are in agreement. It is most important to offer that surprise, because we are in the throes of an era, and I think maybe I should spell it ERROR, like we have never seen. And there is an imperative that we do not become discouraged to the point of being non-participants. And in as much as we're celebrating the birthday of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and correct me if I have the person to whom I attribute the quote wrong. As a matter of fact, I'll think about this, but the statement that was made, not about those who do wrong, but those who sit on the sidelines and allow wrong to be done. This is a participatory exercise, and we must become involved. I had mentioned something about the possibility of optimism. I am concerned, Cheryl Brown Henderson, that our children, and when I say children, I'm talking about all the way to pre-K to 12th grade, are allowed to be political pawns in grown folks' inability to come together. As you talk to particularly high school students, what is a message that we need to be giving to them, thanking them for their courage to matriculate in this climate, but also what would Cheryl Brown Henderson say?
Well, that's a very good point. I think sometimes they don't recognize the power that they have, the power they possess as students and as young people. We have to remind them that the change in this country, that the major change in this country came about because of them. You know, you think about the Children's March in Birmingham, Alabama, and you see the footage, and you think about there's a wonderful video from the Southern Poverty Law Center, Free to Educators. It talks about the Children's March and how the message on when to leave school to go out and march in Kelly Ingram Park was triggered by a radio personality. And when he said a certain thing, you know, that was when you were to get up and go out and march. So we're not talking about old folks. We're not talking about people even in their 40s and 50s that changed this country. We're talking about teenagers. Dr. King himself was 24, 25, just a few years out of his teens. His foot soldiers were teenagers and people in their early 20s. So we need to remind them that, nothing's changed. The youth that made the difference then, it's the youth that can make and should make the difference now. But they need to understand that in order to do that, you need to be informed, you need to be organized. You don't just open the door and step out in the street and start marching. There has to be some agenda. There has to be something at the end of that march that will make the difference. So I think they need to understand that and be told repeatedly and be shown repeatedly the images of those teenagers in the 50s and 60s that changed this country, and be told that you are the ones that we are counting on. We can advise you as old heads, happy to do it, but we want to make sure you understand that you really do have the power, more so than you think, and encourage them to exercise that power in school. You're running for student government or joining organizations, creating their own organizations. Make sure they're speaking up within the confines of the public education system, they can make all the difference in the world. One case I would cite for you, Tinker v. Des Moines, United States Supreme Court decision brought about by high school students in Des Moines, Iowa, of all places, that were in trouble because they were wearing Black armbands in school in protest of the Vietnam War. Kicked out of school. So they, along with their parents, right thinking, took it to the courts, went all the way to the United States Supreme Court, and they won. Basically saying that as a student, you don't give up your right to free speech. You don't give up your right, to peacefully protest what you see going on around you. So the reason we need to know history is exactly that. So they will know, that this is something other young people have done, and they'll know it's what we expect of them, to be academically strong, but to also be active, where they find themselves.
It is very important to me, as I received that from you, which is so very, very important, to look at responsibility for the adults in their lives. Now, one simple manifestation, well, not so simple, but one glaring manifestation just took place in the state of California, in Palo Alto, California, where the superintendent of schools got as many as 800 calls when he asked parents to actually come to the schools to help as substitute teachers, as it were. And when I hear Cheryl Brown Henderson talking about the responsibilities of young people, it certainly does not absolve from responsibility those of us who are adults. And what kinds of things do we need to be doing to support those young people to make it comfortable for them to learn what they need to learn?
Mm-hmm. I think that I'm glad to know about what happened in California. I was not aware. And I think when I mentioned advice, but beyond advice, we to see those parents step in, because right now, with the pandemic that's still running through this country and really decimating, public education period and workplaces more than ever, to think that those parents would step up, and recognize that their ability, their knowledge, their responsibility, to all children, to make certain they are able to get that education we know they're going to need. So I think we do have a responsibility to not turn our backs and not say, all children are our children.
Yes.
Count on them as we grow older, to be in that workplace and to take care of us old folks. They're all our children.
Yes.
And people to suggest, oh no, that's your child. No, it's our child. It may be a cliche that it takes a village, but you and I, Carl, grew up in that era when my father was a minister. So my family was the entire congregation of St. Mark and then Benton Avenue in Springfield, Missouri. All of those folks had parental responsibility, and I knew it. So if any of them felt as though I needed to be corrected, if any of them needed to say a little something to me, as a child, I was to receive it, just like I received it from my own mom and dad in our home. We've gotten away from that, and it bothered me, and I'm glad to see what happened in California, because I worried that people were fearful of being part of children's lives, fearful that their motive would be suspect, fearful that it wouldn't be something appreciated or welcome. So I'm pleased to see a formal structure where parents were asked to step in and be of assistance.
Let me agree with you and validate what you're saying, and then give anecdotally something that occurred in the 1990s. But here I was growing up in the 40s and 50s on the south side of Chicago in the Ida B. Wells housing projects. Here you are growing up later than I did from Topeka, and we are both saying the very same thing. And that is this: there are people who have actually said to me, man, If you grew up on the South Side in the projects, you had to be a tough brother. I know you were a bad dude. And I have to correct them and help them to understand that when I was growing up in the projects on the South Side of Chicago, we were a community and all parents were indeed, this is not a cliche, this is not hyperbole, this is the truth, raised all of us. If it were a weekday at 10 a.m. and I was walking down the street, any adult could say, son, why aren't you in school? And I had to answer. But I mentioned something that happened in the 1990s, and I think it was about probably 1998. I was in Cocoa, Florida, McNair Middle School. Neely Dunn was the principal. And after I had made my presentation, he asked me to tour the school, meet him back at his office later at my leisure. So when I had the occasion to get back to the office, I said, Dr. Dunn, how can you get a teacher-pupil ratio that is so small? And he said, what did you say? I said, how many teachers do you have per classroom? And he said, ours is the normal teacher-pupil ratio. And I said, no, you asked me to visit. When I was visiting, I must have seen at least 3 teachers per classroom, in some cases 4. And he said, no, and then he thought, and he said, oh, Mr. Boyd, you're talking about the students' parents. Not only had they volunteered, their dress was appropriate, their demeanor was professional, and they were, to me, seemingly totally cooperative with each other, and they didn't carry a boast. This looked like what they did. Now, that was at McNair Middle School in Cocoa, Florida, that many years ago, but what a lesson we can learn from that. Now,
I agree with you. I do, Carl, and I know I have grandchildren now that are in school, and my son and his wife are very, very active, and it makes me proud because I know my husband and I were very active when he was in school, so we set the example. So now he is a parent, realizes that in order to have that same rich experience, that he and his wife need to be very much a part of the everyday existence. And I'll tell you the funny story though, because these days, kids don't necessarily live close enough to school, that he drives them within 2 blocks of school, and then they get out and they walk the other 2 blocks as he watches them, so they can have the experience of walking to school. I think that is so funny, because he didn't want to be, drop them off at the door. He wanted them to see what it was like to walk to school. So, they come up with creative ways to, as most parents do, of giving your children experiences that you felt had an impact on your life.
Well, that's interesting. At least he didn't tell the story that Sinbad told.
What's that?
His parents told him that they walked to school 10 inches of snow uphill and back home uphill both ways. So I don't think most of us had quite that experience, but we understand.
No, but I will say this: in the cases, the 5 cases in Brown v. Ford, I will say that there's cases from the South in particular. Our children were treated so very badly. They had to walk miles to school, especially in South Carolina. It was about a 6 or 7 mile one way. And oftentimes children in the South, African-American children, would be 19 and 20 graduating high school because their parents would not allow them to start school until they were physically able to make that walk. And sometimes that was 7, 8 years old when you're just starting school, 9 years old. So, there's so many things that our young people need to know so that they can recognize the benefits, they could recognize the luxury of being in school today and the resources and opportunities because to dismiss it is to really have no interest in your future. So I think that's something they need to know.
Absolutely. Please tell me just a little bit more about Recovering Untold Stories and access to that again.
Yeah, it's on our website, brownvboard.org. At the bottom of the homepage, there's a link where you can read the whole book online, or you can order a hard copy, print on demand, from the University of Kansas. And the idea behind that, we spent 2 years having workshops at the African American Museum of History and Culture in DC to first get people to recognize their stories were important from all cases: Virginia, Delaware, South Carolina, Washington, DC, and Kansas. So convincing them their stories were important. And then the second year, teaching the art of essay writing. So I had Dr. Edgar Tidwell from KU, an English professor, Darren Kennedy, a playwright, and Deborah Dandridge, an African-American historian, worked with us as facilitators during that 2-year period. A grant from the Kansas not Humanities Council, the Hall Center at KU, and a grant from the Walton Family Foundation were the resources we used to make that possible. And then, once the book was published, the Walton Family Foundation financed the book launch all around the country. So we traveled to the East Coast and to the South and places to speak about the book. We brought litigants with us who had written, and so they could have book signings. And I was very impressed by the interest and that foundation had in helping us succeed. I also went to the Black Journalists Annual Convention in Miami. Thousands of African Americans there and hundreds and hundreds of journalists to talk about the book and to have book signing. So, and then I was able to also give out the Educator Awards at their opening session down there in Miami. So it was, and I know, I had to be a groupie for a minute because what was his name? The brother that had the radio show, the hardest working man in radio. I'm trying to think of his name. Yes, Tom Joyner was there. So I had to be, and a lot of other journalists we recognized, but I was just fascinated to be in his presence because he had relocated to Florida in order to vote for Andrew Gillum. So again, he's down for the cause, as they say.
Wow, that's fantastic. Tom Joyner started out, Brother Walker. He was commuting from Chicago to Texas. He had chosen both places. You talk about an icon who makes me think I can. That's Tom Joyner. And I know for a fact that there is so much I want from Cheryl Brown Henderson. It is amazing to me that you have allowed us to get this much time with you. But one of the things that is absolutely imperative is that we do not go away with finding out from Cheryl Brown Henderson whether or not there is something you came to say that I have not broached, because I call it the parking lot conversation. When you get to the parking lot and say, ooh, he didn't ask me this, but something that you think we must know before you go.
Yeah, I will say that even though it doesn't appear as though, we as individual citizens out in the hinterland, have the power, the impact, the influence that we need, because the bills that are going through Congress right now that are in jeopardy, the John Lewis Voting Rights and the For the People Act, to really start policing better and really returning to the voting rights legislation of 65, is critical, because those two pieces of legislation, will really turn the tide on what's happening, the nefarious behavior that's taking place out in the Republican-led states around the country. And I'm saying all this to say that the emails, the phone calls, anything you can do, even to the Republican folks, to let them know that you are watching them, to let them know that you have not forgotten, that they work for you. I think that what's challenging for all of us is people vote and then they sit back. No, once you cast your vote, that's when it's time to get busy, to make sure that there's some accountability. So I want you all to call, to write, to email, to make noise, to pound, the back of your pots and pans to let them know that, we're watching and that we are not ignorant, we are not uninformed, and we recognize what's happening. So I don't know which way it will go, but we can't let it go without a fight. And all of us, even if you're not out marching, you can do something. You can send off that email and every day push that button of that same email if you have to. So it keeps popping up so that they get the message. So I don't know, I can't say it strongly enough that we are in a period of transition that is really frightening. And it really requires that we all, as Harold Melvin in the Blue Notes used to say, wake up, everybody. No more in bed. It's time. It's time.
Wow, that is so important. And what is so very impressive to me is the level at which you have participated in the movement seems to remain at a very high level on a very consistent basis. I don't know how you do it. I am certainly glad that you do. And you are forever in our prayers. And oh, by the way, I did not mention the Brown v. Board of Education National Historic Site. Do I have that right? And that is in Topeka.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
That's right, in Topeka. But let me say, too, to the listeners, that Carl Boyd is my brother, in that we adopted him, 30, 40 years ago. I first met him because he was someone that not only respected and wanted to work with young people, but he was someone that had wisdom in a very early age and a beautiful voice, ladies, one of those voices, a singing voice that would melt you. But I'm so proud to have known you, Carl, for so very many years, and to see that you are still, doing God's work, but doing the people's work and on a mission.
Thank you so very much. I appreciate that. And I promise no one yet has confused me with Harold Melvin, but at least you mentioned my efforts. But on a very serious note, I really cherish our relationship and the family relationship. Wanda and I say, keep on keeping on, and we shall continue to be in touch through the board, of course, and observing what you do and participating.
I gotta say that Carl was there and Wanda at my mother's 100th birthday party, the drive-by party on May 7th in Topeka. And we were so happy to see you. And of course, we were thrilled that she has reached that milestone.
That is so outstanding. And you talk about an honor. My Lord, walking history and just being coherent and being with us. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. This is Wave Your Grace. What, Louis George Walker, how do I even characterize the privilege and honor we have had today? And we certainly want to just thank Cheryl Brown Henderson. We are with you. I know that, my goodness, with the celebration of Dr. King and all of the things that are going on, your schedule is very full. So taking this time out has just been magnificent. Brother Walker, any final instructions for our viewers and listeners and or comments towards Cheryl Brown Henderson this afternoon? Thank you so very, very much. And as Brother Walker knows, because we do it every week and now introducing it to Cheryl Brown Henderson, with each day. Our Stutes for Boots program, Stutes stands for Students Theater of Operations, the school. American students striving for excellence in honor of our troops. I have a message per day. That's 366 days, including leap year through weekends, vacations, and holidays. And I end each program with that day's message. It goes like this: to students across the USA, your Stutes for Boots message for this day, January 15th. Would you let heroes die for your education and decide not to go to school? January 15th. Would you let heroes die for your education and decide not to go to school? My name is Carl Boyd for Wave Your Grades. This is KUAW.org. And now, Brother Walker, I'll see if you can hear the theme song from this end as I say, thank you, Cheryl Brown Henderson. Thank you, Louis George Walker, Carl Boyd, saying, gracious God and wonderful Wanda, I'm on my way home. All right. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. You too. I'll talk to you next week.